Hey, I'm so glad you're with us today on The Perspective as our summer encore series continues. And this week we have a stellar lineup. Our guests talk about everything from a no-nonsense approach to church. Ask not what your church can do, but what you can do for your church. We're going to talk about addictions. We have Daryl Strawberry and his wife with us, a Major League Baseball slugger, a U.S. Senator who walked closely with his wife as she went finally home to the presence of Jesus, but dealt with all sorts of stages of dementia. And there is so much more, including Bonnie Gray, who's going to talk about how to stop worrying and panicking. Well, here on The Perspective, each week through our summer, I want to give you a verse of hope and promise. And for this week, it's found in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. And here's what it says. You can cast your care on him. That's Jesus, because he cares for you. Regardless of what you're dealing with today, I want you to know that you are loved by God and he cares for you. Hey, we're glad you're with us today on The Perspective. And as we're talking about community, we're also reflecting today on the broader community of Canada. And we want to give a shout out to all of our military families, to those who've paid the supreme sacrifice. Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, Julie, if we haven't fought, and our generation really hasn't been to war, though we've sent our military people overseas, it's hard for us to enter into the horrific reality of war.
It's really difficult for us to try to put ourselves into that mindset, whether we were the ones going or whether we were children of seeing our fathers go. It's really difficult, and yet that's why it's even more important for us to remember.
Yeah, and as we remember, I'm thinking myself and my own dad, who spent 27 years in the Canadian military, and I thank God for him. And as he shared some of the stories of what people went through, our hearts are with you today, and we just thank you for the freedom that we have here in Canada, and we are remembering you. You know, it's because of the sacrifice that has been paid and the freedom that we have in Canada, we have something that is called community. Seems that COVID wanted to take that away and destroy the community that we have as Canadians and also in other countries. But here today to talk to us is an amazing pastor right out of the prairies, and we'll have a little bit of fun with that in a few moments. I just want you to welcome Kelly Stickel, who's the lead pastor at Parallel Church in Alberta. He's a speaker and an author, and he cares about community.
Yes.
Welcome, Kelly.
Yes, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike and Julie, so good to be with you guys. I'm excited about our conversation today.
Well, there's lots of questions that we want to talk about.
Yes.
I'm going to let Julie just take the lead here as we jump in.
Yes.
And then I'll come back and hammer away as well with you.
Well, we're going to be talking a lot about community today, but I want to ask you this. Like, we're living in a tribal era where communities aren't as important as tribes for many, and many pit others against others, and to being the best, the strongest, etc. So tell us, how are you working to strengthen communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've noticed, with the era of social media that we have, where, a lot of people have decided to take camps and take sides, whether it's politically, whether it's, socially or whatever, that there's a lot of people that are separating themselves into tribes. And it more culturally than ever, maybe, is we've been focused on dividing, and that if I can't agree with you, then I can't be in your tribe, or I have to kick you out of my tribe. And that's completely opposite of what Jesus taught. Jesus gave, of course, the mandate to his disciples to love one another as he loved. And Jesus was the prime example of how to cross tribes. I mean, just within his own inner circle, he had the zealots, which were basically the modern terrorists to Rome. And on the same team, Jesus had also the tax collector, who was an employee of Rome, and yet they were able to work together and do ministry together. And so we've been really focused throughout the COVID season and just in the last number of years of saying we're going to follow Jesus's mandate to walk alongside, to break down divides. I think it's in 2 Corinthians 5 where Paul said we have a ministry of reconciliation. That's what he was challenging the church to do. The Message Bible says, the Message Bible says it this way, that our job is to persuade men and women to put drop their differences. And
Mm.
so we feel like that's our call. We called our church parallel because we want to come alongside and walk with people instead of against.
Well, Kelly,
Yeah.
let me ask you a question. And this is an easy one. I'm just going to throw you a lob ball so you can knock it out of the park. But I think we got to lay this down as foundational. Why do you think it is so difficult to integrate with other people who are not like ourselves?
Mm.
And especially
Right.
those who don't think or believe what we do. Is it ego? Or do we need to stand for truth?
Mm.
And what do you think Jesus is teaching us through all of this about our heart and his spirit?
Yeah, I think all of us are, as human beings, are naturally, we're selfish. We look out for ourselves. We value our own opinions, and I think we've lost in some way the ability to disagree and still love, to still be in unity, even if we don't agree. And I think we need to get back to the ability, to having healthy debates, to
Mm.
being able to disagree and still love. Jesus had a way of doing that. He would challenge anyone anywhere, but they still felt loved and accepted, and they didn't feel the rejection, even if there
Oh
was a
yeah.
disagreement.
Okay, so let me
So
push
I
Yeah.
think,
back a little bit
yeah,
on that because you're a pastor,
Mhm.
I'm a pastor, and you and I both know that there are some very explosive issues that are dividing denominations, not only around the world, but especially here in Canada. And how do you process that in your own mind? Should we
Mm.
just say everyone is welcome? You can believe what you want, or say, here is where we stand and take it from there?
yeah, I mean, that's a great question. That's the ongoing debate, and I think, when John remarked about Jesus that he was full of grace and truth, and
Mm.
it was something worth remarking and saying he's different, and Jesus was different. He wasn't just truth, and he wasn't just grace. He was a combination of the two. And I think we need to value that and be in the same way, follow after our Lord and Savior, and be like Jesus and being grace and truth, where we can openly disagree, but we can still offer grace and acceptance and relationship. And I think it's all about what we value, and do we value unity over
Mm.
truth, or do we value truth over unity? And
Mm.
where does it come in? And what Jesus prayed, in John 17, his last, one of his last prayers that we have recorded, where he prayed, Father, make them one so that the world will know. And Jesus, I think he prayed that passionately, as one of the most important prayers that he prayed for the church. He didn't pray keep them right or keep
Mm.
them, he prayed keep them one. And I think it's more difficult to be in unity, even especially when we disagree and we have different opinions. And I
Yeah.
think the strength of truth is the ability to disagree and learn and see that as Paul said, we see through the glass dimly. We don't have
Mhm.
all the full perspective. And I need your opinion. I need others' opinions to be able to come to the truth. And I think we need to, again, like I said, come back to the ability to disagree and still stay in community and still
Right.
stay united.
And I think there's such a tension between that grace and truth. And wouldn't you agree that we need to keep that tension? It's not going extreme one
Yeah.
way or the other. We have to keep that, right?
Right. And I think we say grace or truth, right?
Mm.
We're either offering grace and no truth, or we're truth and no grace, or we get lopsided. And I think the healthiest place to be is in, just as you said, in that tension, where there's going to be a tension that we need to interact with and work with, over, and value that tension
Mm.
rather than take sides or take camps or a tribe, as we said.
You mentioned on one of your podcasts about how it's easy for us to serve in the church, but it's more important for us to serve outside of the church. So with that, I want to say, what is the church's responsibility or people within it to reach out to people in our communities?
I think throughout the COVID season, this really hammered home for me more than ever. Is when the governments locked us down and we were unable to meet as a community. A lot of pastor friends, we had lots of conversations with pastor friends and they were, very upset with the government, of course, and locking us down. And I thought, have we reduced our faith to just a weekly social gathering and a personal faith? And if we've done that, I think we miss the mandate of Christ. I think we miss what we're called to do as the church. And I really think that we're supposed to be. God called us to go into all the world, preach the gospel. He's gave us a mandate to love one another, but also he gave us a mandate to minister to the least of these. And I think as a church, I just felt really strongly that we, as a church, we need to get more involved in our community rather than expecting our community to come to us. That we need to go to them.
Well, Kelly, we're going to come back and talk about that because you got an exciting story, lots of illustrations on that very subject. So stay with us. We're talking right now to lead pastor of the Parallel Church in Alberta, Kelly Stickel. We're going to be right back. Well, we're here again today with Kelly Stickel, who is the lead pastor at Parallel Church in Alberta. And he has thought through what it means for the church to be the church and to connect with communities. Kelly, just tell us a little bit about your own story, especially most recently with Parallel, and then we want to dive into why is it that churches seem to miss their opportunity for growth? So many are closing down.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and a lot of pastors are panicking over not having the numbers come back, post pandemic, and wondering. And the reality is I don't know that the numbers will ever come back in the same way that we've seen before with the same people, and some people have just gone. But I think we have to get back to the question of what's the purpose of the church? Why do we exist? Or do we exist to just put on a weekly social gathering and inspire a personal faith? And if that's the reason of the church, then I think, the church honestly is quite weak, and the gates of hell might prevail. But if the church is to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the community, and then throughout the pandemic, I began doing a lot of research, in particular on the early church in the first 3 centuries, and realized, hey, this is when the governments actually actively stood against the church, and yet the church didn't just survive, it thrived and expansively grew. And I was like, what did they do different? And I was shocked to discover that the Romans didn't even know that the church met weekly for about 70 years. But they did know.
Surprise.
And what was written what they did know is they did know that Christians were feeding the hungry, taking care of the needy, that when plagues would show up in Rome, that the Christians were the ones that would run in and take care of the sick, what everybody else would turn away and run from. That even though the Christians were persecuted and oftentimes put to death and blamed for a lot of the plagues, they still went out and took care of the needs. And that the greatest growth, this is what I learned, Mike and Julie, is the greatest growth in the history of the church happened in the 3rd century, where we don't have a revival that happened. We don't have a prominent leader that we can really speak of in that century. But what we do have is one of the greatest plagues that plagued the fifth of the Roman Empire was wiped out in 249. It lasted about 20 years. And in the midst of that, the church went from the beginning of the 3rd century, 280,000 members, 280,000 people on the planet were Christian. By the end of the 3rd century, over 6 million were Christian, and all that the Christians did was take care of the sick, feed the hungry, and were active in the community and offering hope to the hopeless. And I feel like we're in, economically, with pandemics, with wars, and all the things that are going on, people are looking for hope. We have the hope as the church, and we need to get to them and minister to them where they're at.
Well, let's flip that around a bit. Julie's got a question for you that I think is going to expose maybe another problem that we need to deal with.
Yeah, there are movements underway in culture that point toward inner self-healing. In your church, you have a saying, accountability takes place when winning is rewarded, mediocrity is challenged, and losing is penalized. How important is it to point the finger at ourselves as a church as we operate in the community?
I think it is of utmost importance. Let me put it this way. I was reading the book of Nehemiah, and actually I did a series at our church for 17 weeks on the book of Nehemiah. I spent probably half of that in Nehemiah 1. I was so fascinated by the call of God on Nehemiah. And one of the things that I admire most about Nehemiah, of course, being famous for being sent back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. But the reason why I believe he was chosen was, it says in Nehemiah 1, and he heard the report of the state of his land, and he wept and he mourned and for days, it says. And then his prayer was, and this is what just got me. He said in his prayer, he says, I and my fathers have sinned. And I was like, that's interesting, because this is 70 years after the exile. Nehemiah may have not even been alive, during the exile. If he was very young in that time. Why would he take personal responsibility for the state of his nation? He didn't cast the blame on God abandoning them. He didn't cast the blame on the king who conquered them. He didn't cast the blame on his ancestors alone. He said, I and my father's house have sinned. And it hit me, and I was like, the person who takes responsibility is given the ability to respond. If we abdicate responsibility, we give the ability to respond to somebody else. So if we point the blame at the government for all of our problems, we are empowering them to have the ability to respond. If we point the blame at, anyone else, we give them the ability to respond. If we accept responsibility, that gives us the ability to respond. And I felt that Nehemiah accepting responsibility was what God's attention, and God was able to say, okay, this is my guy. This is the guy that's going to make a difference. And I feel like if as a church, we want to take our nation back, I think we need to first and foremost accept our responsibility and saying, hey, Jesus called us to be the light of the world. Darkness has no power. It's just simply the absence of light. If the world is getting darker, it's because the light is dimmer. And Jesus said, hey, don't put the light under a basket. What if the basket is our churches, where we keep the gospel in our comfortable little settings in there, and that's the only time that we're bold in preaching the gospel? What if we got out and shined the light in our community? Could we possibly make a difference?
Well, Kelly, our time is almost running out, but let's push that just a little further, because it's never easy to step outside, and it's easy to stay downstairs in our rec room with our big screen TV and eating, all our junk food while the world goes to hell in a handbasket. And we can say that. Give me one story of how you and your church have moved into the community.
Yeah, we started, a mission called My City Care. And My City Care, we decided we're going to take responsibility for our communities, our cities. And we started just finding needs in the community and meeting them. And it started by handing out Christmas presents to kids who couldn't afford Christmas. That was the first thing we did. Well, throughout the pandemic, we had the province of Alberta give our church over $100,000 to feed the community, because they said, you guys are doing a better job than we are.
Fabulous.
The government gave the church the money. Like, that's amazing. Now we're in 41 different communities in Alberta and in BC. And in Saskatchewan. And we are now working alongside churches in Medicine Hat, for instance, where we don't have a church. We don't have a church at all, but we have 16 churches that are taking the mandate of My City Care and going into their own community and feeding the hungry and taking care of the needs. And that's what I'm passionate about, igniting the church to take our job back. And taking our job back as the social arm, as the center of hope in each of our communities. And if we could do that, become the light in our communities, I think we could change the world.
Well, I love your passion, and it just stirs me up, and it really is a message that we all need to hear. We could go on, but we've run out of time, and I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your heart with us today. This has been incredible inspiration for all of us, and I hope our viewers really take note of what you're doing and get excited and see what they can do with their planet. Thank you for joining us today, Kelly.
One thing, Kelly, before you go,
thank you so much.
Tell people how to connect with you, especially pastors and leaders that are listening right now. You got a website, I'm sure. You've heard of those things?
Yes, we have a website, parallelchurch.com. You can reach me on social media. My handle is Kelly Stickel, and feel free to reach out. I'd love talking to pastors and helping wherever we can.
Hey, thanks so
Great.
much. We'll
Thank
talk again
you.
soon.
Yes, thanks so much, Mike and Julie. What a privilege to talk with you guys.
You know, when people's needs are screaming so loudly, whether it's physical or financial or emotional or relational, they're not going to hear any spiritual message. And I think that's what Kelly's really, hitting home, that we need to be the boots out there. We need to be the hands and the feet. What are we doing? Are we just having a great time inside? Or are we actually doing something that matters to the needs of people out there?
Well, and Kelly is certainly doing that. And the story
Mhm.
of Parallel Church is just wonderful.
It really is.
He's not the first person, though.
Mhm.
I'm thinking back to one of the early church fathers, St. Augustine, who
Right.
made famous a line. He said, preach the gospel wherever you go, and if necessary,
Use words.
use words. And I just want to encourage you, as I did someone earlier today, just to get connected in a church. Julie, one man said to me years ago, he said, Michael, he said, if you find a perfect church, don't go to it because you're going to wreck it.
That's so
That's
good.
actually what he said to me. And I've never forgotten. His name was Charlie Leach. He started a camp. He worked with people and just blessed people, worked tirelessly. But if I could say something today to people, it is just simply this. Don't look for a perfect church,
Yeah.
but look for a place where you can serve, where you can be the hands and feet of Jesus. Come alongside your pastor or leaders and just say, hey, I'd like to do something to help people. Will you let me? They're going to say, yes. During the course of this week, I want to talk to you about life's defining moments. We're just listening to Kelly Stickel share his story. And if you were to look at some of the backstory of his life, he had to make some decisions, defining moments. Likely as you're watching today, you're dealing with some defining moments. Maybe it's not right at this moment, maybe it was last week, maybe it'll be next week, but sooner or later, you deal with defining moments. And what are you going to do? How are you going to respond to the need? I was on one of those exotic cruise ships, and it was a beautiful evening that the people were gathered at the bow of the ship, and they were watching a school of sharks down below. When suddenly there was a scream, and this young, beautiful lady fell overboard, and nobody knew what to do until there was another scream, and an elderly gentleman was seen diving through the air, and he lands in the water. He sees her, and he grabs her. By this time, the ship's crew had thrown the rope ladder down, and he pulls her to safety. Everybody applauds. It was a defining moment for that elderly man. And later on that evening, as the ship's captain hosted a special dinner for the two of them and their friends, he said to the elderly gentleman, he said, tell me what was going through your mind as you were diving into the water to rescue that young woman. And he said, well, he said, to be honest, he said, I was wondering who in tarnation pushed me. And I was thinking about what I'd like to do to them if I ever came out of the water alive. Well, maybe your defining moment, and I hope you're smiling just a little bit, is not quite like that. But no doubt about it, as we read through the scriptures, we find over and over again God's people dealing with defining moments. And the defining moment can be you run into a situation. You run into a scenario, maybe like Kelly Stickel was talking about, and saying, what are we going to do? We're going to help the poor. We're going to feed people. Are we going to take care of that person who has nowhere else to go? Or what about that teenager that needs someone to come alongside of them? What are we going to do? And through this week, and beginning right now, I want to take you to the book of Joshua. Joshua is in the Old Testament, and in the book of Joshua, chapter 3, we find a defining moment. And the defining moment is this. Joshua has taken over as leader. Moses is dead. And now we find Joshua at the Jordan River. It's flood season. It's a raging torrent. And the people are behind him, and they've got to cross through the river. How are they going to do it? It's a crisis. It's a crisis that they're facing. My brother, who's been on the program many times, once said this, and I've remembered. He said, the time to prepare for a crisis is before you're in it. And so here we find the hero of the story, Joshua, getting up early in the morning to meet his defining moment. Now, it doesn't tell us for sure, but I would have to think that he probably didn't get much sleep the night before, weighing the pros and cons, but grappling with the question, can I trust God? Because God has said that just as he had been with Moses, he would be with him. But now, God allows him to be put to the test. You know, at any other time of the year, the Jordan River could be crossed over quite easily. But at flood season, an angry torrent of water, it would sweep the people away. Much like a friend of mine years ago was telling me about the hurricane that hit Toronto and flooded the Humber River. And he talked about how some members in his family were swept away. Well, the Jordan River was equal, if not greater, to what was happening. And as Joshua's defining moment is as great as anything you and I will ever have to go through, as a leader, he was facing insurmountable obstacles. I've experienced those in my life, even recently. But I've discovered that God is more than enough. And as we think about defining moments, in the coming teaches that I'm going to give this week, we're going to look at 5 things that become our defining moment. How you and I handle pain or success, how we handle the unexpected, are just 2 of the things. We're going to look at the defining moment of who we choose to serve. But more than anything else, you need to remember this, that you can make a decision, but that decision will turn around and make you. You need to think clearly, how am I going to decide and who am I going to choose to follow? And can God be trusted? And I'm here to share with you from the perspective and from my own point of view that the answer to that question is always a resounding yes. He can be trusted. Hey, do you remember what I said at the beginning of the program today? That you can cast your care on him because he cares for you. We'd love to help you do that by making available today a free copy to the first 20 people who write in of Ken Shigematsu's book, and it's called Survival Guide for the Soul. How important is that? Talks about the rhythms of life. Ken is an awesome writer. He's a pastor. He lives in Vancouver, and I know that his writing will touch your heart. Why don't you write in and request this so that we can send it to you? And would you think about being a regular partner with us to help support us as we reach across the country with the life-changing message of God's love? You know, as you've been watching the program today, has God's Spirit been nudging you in your heart? And you're just saying, I'd love to have a relationship with Jesus. We have another little book that we want to make available free of charge to you today if you write in. It's called Just Start. You've seen me put this out many times before. It'll help you in your spiritual journey with Jesus. But hey, right now, together, we can pray. And I'd like to invite you to pray with me a simple prayer to say, Lord Jesus, I want to trust you to be my Savior. I want to give you the cares that I'm dealing with today. They're greater than I can handle, but I'm trusting for you to be there, to be my Savior and Lord and friend. And if you've prayed that prayer today, write to us at theperspective.tv.